Okay. Ready? I'm ready. You give me what I should. Hi, everyone. I'm Gina, Lagomarsino, the CEO of Results for Development, and I'm very delighted to welcome you all today to this launch of the Governance Action Hub. And I am delighted to both welcome all those folks that are here in person today in Washington, D.C. at the Open Gov Hub. And thank you so much to our hosts at the Open Gov Hub for being here and letting us use this beautiful space. And I'm also really delighted to welcome all of you who are joining from different spots around the world virtually. Thank you so much for being here today. And in a moment, I'm going to invite Mario Picon, who is the director of the Governance Action Hub, to talk a little bit more about our great agenda. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers today. But before I do that, I just want to share for a moment why I am so excited to launch this hub today. Results for Development, our mission is to support the change agents who are building strong systems for health, education, and nutrition around the world. And throughout our 15-year histories, we've been supporting leaders to create really strong societies that support all of their people. We've been very committed to promoting good governance. And this has been both about trying to ensure that leaders stay accountable to their people and that we support people to hold their and citizens to hold their leaders accountable. That's crucially important in all countries around the world, but it's particularly important in countries that are resource rich, because we want to make sure that the benefits of those resources accrue to all people across the society, not just a few. And so that is the ultimate goal of the Governance Action Hub, and why it's really important to me and important to our mission at R4D. So now, actually, I'm so delighted to welcome, joining us virtually from London, hopefully the technology will work, Claire Harbron, who is the Chief Investment Officer at the BHP Foundation. Claire, are you here? I'm hoping we can see you. Hi, Claire.
I am here. Hopefully you can see or hear me.
See you and hear you, and I think we're going to spotlight you here in the room. Wonderful to have you here. As I mentioned, Claire is the Chief Investment Officer at the BHP Foundation, and we are really, really delighted that BHP has been a supporter of this kind of work for many years and has recently decided to support the Governance Action Hub, which is going to enable us at R4D and all of our partners to begin work with a number of countries around the world and also support learning and collaboration between the global and the country level. So really, really happy to have you here with us today, Claire. And I'd love for you to, offer your opening remarks and maybe tell us a little bit more about the Natural Resource Governance Program at BHP as a starting point.
I would be delighted to. Thank you, Gina. So first of all, look, thank you very much for having me join you today. I'm delighted to be here to launch this incredibly exciting initiative. So thank you to you and Mario for the inclusion in this event. So I would love to talk a little bit about the foundation and our program. So maybe I'll just start off, as you said, by introducing myself. So my name's Claire Harbron. I'm the Chief Investment Officer at the BHP Foundation. The BHP Foundation is a US charitable organization funded solely by BHP, which is a leading global resources company. And as a global philanthropy, just to really call out our role is collaborating with partners to support catalyzing new solutions for social and environmental challenges aligned to our vision. And our vision as the BHP Foundation is about a more equitable and sustainable future for people and planet. And so we support catalytic efforts that align to our strategic areas, which includes natural resource governance, environmental resilience, education and young people, and also Indigenous rights and self-determination. So like many of us, and I suspect like every single person in either the room or online today, at the foundation, we feel, a real increasing sense of urgency towards these issues. We recognize that choices and decisions we make and actions that we take now will have implications for the sustainability of our planet and our quality of life, our shared quality of life. for centuries to come. And I heard a phrase the other day, and it really resonated with me. And that phrase is that we're in a race. We're in a race between tipping points. And I think that couldn't be more true. And at the foundation, we know which tipping point we want to win that race. It's the tipping point where we fundamentally do things differently, where we really seek to change the status quo. So we've made our choice and we want to play our parts in that. So at the foundation, we try to challenge ourselves to be not shy about pursuing difficult issues, to be unafraid to lean in. And we seek to partner with organizations who share those same values, who want to pioneer new solutions. And in doing so, then share insights and evidence to enable those solutions that are successful to be sustained, scaled, and mainstreamed. So one of our programs, as you mentioned, Gina, is the Natural Resource Governance Program. And the core of that is really recognizing the fact that with the increase in investment in mining that we all anticipate to see over the next decade as we look to the energy transition, the risk reward profile of those activities and that investment is going to be amplified, frankly. The risk, we know this, the risk is that lack of transparency and accountability could create the environment for corruption to flourish. And if corruption flourishes, then citizens will be denied the benefits which should be flowing to them from the extraction of their natural resources. On the flip side, the reward or the opportunity really relies on translating that mineral wealth, that vast mineral wealth, into improved life prospects for citizens of those countries. And in particular, let's remind ourselves of that shocking statistic, the 1 billion people who are currently living in poverty in countries rich in natural resources. So our programme at the foundation, frankly, aims to skew that risk-reward profile to reduce the risk and maximise the opportunity for the reward. So we support partners to work across the natural resource value chain to enhance governance, reduce corruption, and crucially, enable people to have the agency and voice in decisions that affect them. So our programs really fundamentally want to ensure that those citizens in those countries are the ultimate owners and primary benefactors of the natural resource wealth. How to do that? Well, we seek to do that with you by building platforms of collaboration. We think that's incredibly important between different stakeholders, including international institutions, government, civil society, and business. And so at the moment, we have 6 projects in this programme, working, as I said, across the value chain and run by world-leading organisations. And of course, Results for Development is one of those. So that's our background, Gina. That's why we're here today and very pleased to be so.
Great. Thank you so much, Claire. I really appreciate both your grounding us in this tipping point we are facing as a world and how important that is for us all to be paying attention to, and the collaboration it's going to require to address that. And also your points about the fact that increase in mining is going to be something that is incredibly important to address the energy transition, and that it also comes with these risks. And I think you've laid out exactly why this work is so important at this moment. So thank you so much for that. And thank you for your work at the foundation. Maybe you could say a little bit more about, you talked broadly about the work of BHP Foundation, but how this particular governance action hub fits into that broader agenda for natural resource governance that you just mentioned.
Absolutely. So as I mentioned, from our perspective, building trust and enabling people in these countries, in resource-rich countries, to have agency and voice in the decisions that are affecting them is, they're 2 essential elements to eliminating corruption and harnessing that potentially transformative power of that natural resource wealth, ultimately for sustainable and inclusive development. And I don't think it's an overstatement to say that improved governance of natural resources will be the keystone of a successful energy transition over the next decade and beyond. And if you'll allow me to sort of horribly mix my metaphors, you know, potentially the make or break piece of that puzzle, at least from our perspective. So we believe that this model of collective action that you've envisioned and are bringing to life, led by the Governance Action Hub, is exactly what's needed to increase participation in these activities, to create locally led solutions. That's really important, and build trust that will contribute to improve governance systems, which is all about ultimately supporting a just transition and fundamentally improving outcomes for people at the end of the day. I think one of the other things that's really exciting for us about this particular project and the R4D approach is this really strong partnership approach. So what we see you building here is this incredibly important collaborative way of going about things, working with civil society leaders and partners in each country, and through them working to engage and influence government and other actors to drive reform. And this is important, and we share the same view as you, that the kind of systemic and enduring also being very important, enduring positive change that we need at the speed and scale. I mean, so many buzzwords just in that sentence, but they're all so important, can only happen through collaboration. I think it's also worth building on your point from earlier, Gina, that we're also just really pleased to build on the partnership that we have with you. We've worked with you since 2017 under the Foundation's Leveraging Transparency to Reduce Corruption project, which is a partnership between the Brookings Institution and yourselves, R4D. And so really we're thrilled. It's, you know, with huge enthusiasm that we've made our commitment to this project, committing $6.25 million over the next 5 years. And we really believe that it's this type of project that can help us contribute to that big, lofty ambition that we have and that we all share for a more sustainable future for ourselves and our planet.
Thank you so much, Claire. This has been a phenomenal partnership. And I just want to underscore this approach to locally led development and partnership, and how crucial it is for all the work we do, and particularly in this Governance Action Hub. It's so important to make sure that we understand the context of where we are working, that we enable different partners to come together across sectors, government, civil society, industry, to develop solutions that really make sense in their own context. It's also crucially important, in addition to having those conversations and dialogues at the local level, to make sure that there is exchange between global level folks who are generating evidence and working across other countries back down to particular places where this work is happening. And I think that's the kind of collaboration that we like to promote, and we're very excited to promote it here with the Governance Action Hub, building on all the work in the past. So thank you so much for this wonderful welcome. Is there anything more you want to share with the group before I hand it over for the next segment of this session?
Not at all, other than to reiterate that I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm looking forward to listening in to the rest of the session. Thank you, Gina.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to you, Claire, and to your colleagues there at BHP in London. So now it gives me great pleasure to welcome Mario Picon, who is the Director of the Governance Action Hub, and he is going to show some more about the hub. And are we bringing up Danny as well too? I know he's going to have a conversation with our R4D Senior Fellow, Danny Kaufman, as well. Should I welcome?
Welcome to that.
All right, Danny, please come up. I'm gonna say goodbye to you all and step off and turn it over to my colleagues here. Thank you.
Thank you, Gina. Appreciate it. Hey, Danny. Welcome, please. So, welcome everybody. Oh, thank you. Thank you much. Appreciate it. So, good morning, afternoon, or evening, everyone, depending on where in the world you are joining us today from. We are extremely thankful for you being here with us, be in person or virtually, for the launch of the Governance Action Hub. Special thanks for those of you that were able actually to join us in person today, right? Like, you could very well have to stay home and join us virtually, but we promise we will make our best to respond to your interests. Thank you for being here. In a moment, I'm going to introduce properly Danny, right? And we're going to be having a conversation around governance, state capture, and climate change. But first, I just wanted to point out something. It is not a coincidence that we're meeting here, right? Like at the Open Gov Hub for the launch of a different hub. During the last 11 years, under the dedicated coordination of Global Integrity and Development Gateway, with Accountability Lab very much involved in a network of affiliated hubs, the Open Gov Hub has shown the way towards collaboration and reduction of silos. We will talk more about the Governance Action Hub, but why we start today talking about governance, climate change, and energy transition? No, it is not because all cool kids are talking about it, right? Like, but there is a reason why it's so omnipresent right now. Is precisely because it is an urgent matter. It's because we have known for a while, right, like of the deep consequences that this has for people directly, for countries, for our activities, for our way of life, right? But it still seems that this urgency, this importance has only been like fully acknowledged, and sometimes it's still not fully acknowledged, sadly, in certain quarters, in recent times. It feels also that sometimes we only bring attention to this when there are tragedies, and those tragedies are happening very often. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And why is governance in the end so important in this conversation? We also see that in a way, it is also a catalyzing topic. People are concerned, especially when extreme climate occurrences affect their way of living. It is a problem that has only grown larger and more challenging, partially, we will argue, of governance failures and others, and state capture in particular. And it is a challenge where our efforts to tackle it will require us to deal with legacy challenges, which have weakened trust of people in their institutions, the democratic system, and the possibility of change. And to discuss more in detail the connection between governance, climate change, and energy transition, we're honored and thankful to have with us Danny Kaufman. Danny is an international leader in governance, anti-corruption, and natural resource management. He is a senior fellow with us at Resource for Development. He's also a senior fellow at Brookings Institution, chief advisor at Natural Resources Governance Institute, having served as its president and CEO from 2013 to 2020. And until recently, member of the EITI International Board. He has served as director of the World Bank Institute, where he pioneered approaches to measure, diagnose, and address governance and corruption, helping formulate action programs. Good morning, Danny. Good to be with you. Welcome to this lunch.
Thank you, Mario. Thanks to everybody being here. And greetings to you all. Off script, if you allow me, at the personal level, I cannot say good morning because it has been horrible. We all know what has happened in the Middle East in the face of utmost brutal crimes committed by terrorists, and that I think that's put things a bit in stark perspective. I know that we are going to address very important governance issues. In some sense, we're talking about the utmost failure in governance, but on the very tough, brutal side of governance that sometimes we don't fully deal with in these more lofty confines, and we do concentrate more on the soft side of governance. But I think what has happened, particularly on Shabbat in the Saturday massacre, reminds us that that there is evil in this world which is not captured in our analytical work, in our data, in our initiatives, and it's beyond obviously the realistic scope of even an ambitious and important initiative that we're all launching today can hope with. I cannot help but being reminded by the noted Holocaust survivor philosopher Elie Wiesel, who famously said, after having witnessed and lived through the Holocaust, anything that is imaginable is possible. And I think this is a reminder, and obviously it's not the only such event. We have been faced with this event, where it's put in Bucha, in Ukraine, and of course, 9/11 more in the past. But I think it's a shock reminder to the system. Now, to link it to our conversation of what you may be asking me, these still at the model level trying to reflect on the role that our work in governance can play ahead, even in the context of this broader perspective of what has just happened. First, in terms of working on coalitions that was just mentioned, with the vast majority of citizens in the world that do not engage in the mass murder of babies and mothers and others, and believe in humankind, even if we agree to disagree. And there are many such venues. But then related to that is to think much harder about the role of prevention. And in that context, data and analytics can, what we have been doing with the worldwide governance indicators and so on, provide, and has provided in the past, early flags of countries that are descending into quasi-failure or failed states, which we are dealing with right now in the case of the Middle East, but also in other areas of the world that can then create the conditions for this type of massive. And last but not least, get into our own path that you have in mind, Mariam, is to think harder perhaps as to how to engage even within the governance action hub with some post-conflict settings. So prevention, on the one hand, it's incredibly difficult, and it's another kind of, basically, another type of challenge to engage in places that are in the midst of conflict. There, we can do very little. This is being dealt by others right now. But what about pre-conflict and descent? How to avoid the descent into this madness, and then in terms of the post-conflict. But thanks for the space to provide this, because I thought it was important to bear in mind that it's a larger perspective that at least to many of us are very traumatic.
Absolutely, and thank you very much, Danny, for keeping us grounded also, and acknowledging what is happening around us, right? Like, and those roots and connections also between what is happening around the world, and also the kind of work that we do more likely in the governance space. One of the things that we have been discussing a lot, like we have discussed personally in the past, and that is very much present in our conversations with different stakeholders, not only here, but in the context, most importantly, is this sense of urgency, particularly around issues that affect directly people, right? Related, for example, with climate change. We have been working for the last few years, as Gina mentioned, right, in this program, FDRC, with Brookings Institution, very much focused on the extractive sector, right? Like, but we understood, like, over time also, and in the discussion about this program, how the governance challenges that condition and that lead to that particular challenges in the extractive sector are much larger, systemic, right? Like, and require like a very strong approach to collaboration around. What we see in general is that we think is that our diagnostic is that any action like towards climate change and its consequences is gonna like very much be weakened by an existing and prevailing lack of confidence of people, right? Even among professionals like us many times, right? In our institutions or in the possibility of change, right? Like, do you personally share this diagnosis? What is it that we need more in this space, in the governance and anti-corruption?
Well, I think, again, this week and what has happened also with the war, the brutal war of Putin in Ukraine, reminds us that urgency is crucial here. And nothing stops for considering very urgent on the side of evil. So the forces of evil have no qualms of operating with extreme urgency. The evidence shows very clear that over the past, essentially since 2006, there's been a democratic decline in terms of democratic institutions, civic space, and all that around the world. And if anything, that has sped up over the past year or two for reasons that are well known. We don't need to get into that. This is also very much related to obviously geopolitics, but also to the rise of content. And that, so the sense of urgency should be shared by the side of good, not only by the side of evil. And urgency, there is an urgency. What is a logical implication? Since we, the reasonable people in the middle, are so far behind the other forces, and the decline that is clear, then as we have written about, and we did a survey about it a couple of years ago, clearly suggested that more audacity is needed. So if it can be encapsulated in one notion, I would say we need a major dose of additional audacity. Not just ambition, but being audacious about our initiative, what we do, being clear that as a result, because the ask, the audacity and the ambition is going to be much higher, the probability of success is going to be much lower. But that's where the donors also come in terms of how do they regard a successful program or not. If, let me submit, and I had this argument forever when I used to be at the World Bank, where there was an extremely rigorous and they still is evaluation department, and I looked at all the data in terms of what projects were successful, unsuccessful, and so on. And the aim was to maximize the success of projects. And the case I made was that if we go beyond 80 to 85%, we are not taking enough risk. We are cherry picking and we're not doing enough. So I think being audacious, coupled with the recognition that that means that we're going to have failures, we're going to learn also from failures, but also when we have a success, the payoff is going to be so much larger than from those safe cherry-picked programs where it would be incremental progress, which nowadays, given the challenges around the world.
Thank you, Danny, for that. And if I may remind for everybody here in the room, but also for those that are joining us online, please, if you have any questions that are arising based on the conversation, anything you always wanted to ask about governance and climate change and energy transition and you didn't have a chance to, please go ahead. We're happy to actually try to answer or start pointing to certain responses about. And what we'll do is like at the end of the conversation, towards the end of the conversation, we're going to see if we have a few questions and we'd be happy to respond to those. Danny, sorry.
No, thank you for this, because I hope also in our conversation there is frankness and audacity on our side, because I don't think this is a time for political correctness. And let me just add on the issue of audacity. Yeah, I mean, the audacity is an incredible display by the forces of evil. I mean, look what Putin has done, what Hamas, And I know they will mention many others, and also at the software levels and political parties and how they function and so on. Yet, on our side, we have remained relatively tame and conservative. And that's what comes out from our survey. It's not just us saying, we had what, 400 respondents throughout the national resource governance field and beyond, also in others. And basically, the notion was, well, we don't think there is hope for a lot of progress. We need progress, we need reforms. The probability and likelihood of reform is low. And so let's be modest in terms of our ask, in terms of our ambition. And frankly, among ourselves, this was not just the respondents from multilateral organizations and from governments. It's not that surprising, but equally from civil society at the time. So that notion of the dose of more ambition and audacity was lacking there. It's not lacking on the other side.
Yeah, I think I guess that is great that counter that you make it when ambition and audacity. So I think particularly that focus on action. I also feel that as you were saying, right, like the other team, right, like the other people that is like engaged in corruption or are benefiting from the status quo, they play a different game to us, like in terms of incentives, in terms of like our possibility of actually motivating and pushing for change. Partially because like the way that we're approaching many programs in development is very much project-based and don't necessarily, despite the fact that we know this and we talk about this and we have been talking about years about this, we need some room for more testing, experimentation, but very substantial learning that moves us forward, that is based and focused on action. And we talk a lot about like raising voices, and I guess that raising voices is fantastic. I guess that we need also to be more intentional about raising and identifying and stimulating ideas particularly from local stakeholders. And there has been a lot of conversation about this. A couple of weeks ago, I had the opportunity to be at Climate Week, right? Like with many colleagues, right? Like from companies, from private sector, from international development, right? And everybody seems very clear and very agreeing, aligned in terms of like, yeah, we need to actually like put people in the middle, in the center, right, of the action, right? But the how, based on the structure that we have, is not so clear. Let me go back, particular to one idea that you were actually one of the ones generating or like steering a lot of conversation about it, like what, 22 years ago, right? Which is specifically about state capture, right? Like in the work that you did at the time with Joel Hellman. Like, I have known you for years, but it's like we have had more of like a close relationship and engagement only a few years ago. But I got to know actually you and your work through that particular kind of work. And I feel that particularly in the last few years, our mention everywhere about state capture, it completely just went beyond the academic or the theoretical or the discussion, right, on a paper from the World Bank, right? And it's there. Sometimes we don't call it like that, but in our engagement in countries with local stakeholders, it comes out, right? Like these challenges, this lack of trust, even sometimes in traditional leaders that have always been like the anchor, right? In many ways of like the last remnant of trust between people in institutions, being formal and informal. Tell us a little bit about like, how do you feel that this discussion around state capture has evolved? How has it manifested in the work that we do in this space? You have been part of the IPI, you have been pushing a lot of excellent work from NRGI that now Sunita Kamal has continued. Like, how do you feel about it? How do you see it? How we make progress? What else should we be doing?
Okay, thanks, Mari. Fast rewind, and to make it very clear, I think the only way I've ever been able to make progress is through collective action, basically, in terms of the analytical work, in terms of the empirical work, in terms of all this innovation, was always with somebody else. I think having a joint project makes a sharing, but then working together is absolutely crucial. So thank you for mentioning this, but this is not about an individual. So first, let's rewind. After we started with our trade, the governance indicator, and I had been also very involved with the former Soviet Union, having been the first head of the World Bank in Ukraine right after independence started. Then I met Joel Hellman, who was working on Russia, and we shared his observation that the whole study and the approach, very tame again, about corruption, was something major. The whole approach about corruption and governance, the little that was being done about governance at the time, basically was trying to figure out how people just get around the existing rules of the game in the country and the institutions to benefit themselves. But what we posited is that something much more nefarious is those potentates, those extremely undue influential people shape the rules of the game for their own benefit and shape the institution at the cost and the consequences for society that could be manifold, just getting around and getting a transaction with a bribery and so on. So that motivated it, and we decided at the time, and also with our prayer on the governance indicator was taboo to measure all these things. In fact, at the World Bank, there was no yet authorized environment. Then Jim Wilkinson came and gave us authorization to work on those things. But I had started by stealth in Ukraine with some colleagues, and thanks to a minister, a very young minister, I started doing surveys, and then I got scolded by the chief counsel of the World Bank. But thanks to the cover of that, and that's how we started, because we challenged the whole notion that the whole field of governance and corruption was not subject to measurement. And that's basically, it's one little kernel of audacity, but we were not. That was not audacity putting our lives at risk like others do. We were putting only our jobs at risk. And then, so we started with that. At the time, it got a lot of attention for the former Soviet Union, it was a 4 countries in transition. And over time, it has gotten a bit of traction, sometimes more recently more, other times less. The case of South Africa is very interesting, and I had to go before the National Commission, the Zondo Commission, basically for hours and hours, and to testify about what it means in the rest of the world and so on. They didn't talk throughout the commission for all the work about what had happened with the former president and with the Gupta gate and so on. They didn't talk about corruption. They talked only about state capture. So that got some attention, increasingly in Latin America and other countries. So that has got some attention. But let's face it, these are very sensitive issues. So there's a lot of pushback from some quarters, from some political quarters, from government and so on. So when we embrace this type of work, we don't win any popularity contest. It's different than education for all and so on, which we all believe in. But if there is no governance, it's state capture. Forget education for all. Forget the results on health. But the framework and the lens of state capture has helped me and has helped us in different contexts. And let me give the example of EITI, a very concrete and specific level. Two episodes in EITI, very far apart. 7, 8 years ago, there was complete pushback from the other constituencies. I was representing one person represented civil society. The other constituencies, no, why should civil society have particular protections and safeguards and so on? This is just about ensuring transparency. We made a case that accountability, participation were absolutely crucial to get results. It was considered that we cannot get particular protections and safeguards for civil society. We did analytical work. We showed, we did a board meeting where we presented with data the link between voice and accountability on the other hand, and the effectiveness of transparency and anti-corruption in the Alamo. Bottom line, we got protections and safeguards for civil society and prerequisites for entry into the idea that you had to comply at least with sufficient protection for civic space and civil society. Much more recent, just a couple of months ago, we were together at the big forum in Dakar, where the new standard, every 3-4 years, there's a new standard of the EITI, totally refreshed. It was considered inconceivable just a year and a half ago that energy transition and addressing climate change could be part of EITI, whose remit was considered to be totally different. And when I re-entered the board, which I did over the past year, I was asked to do that for particular circumstances. I was told you have to be realistic, because they know that I like audacity. You have to be realistic. We cannot achieve much on this and so on. I didn't listen. I had an ally or two of there. We pushed until the last second. We got energy transition. The companies now have to report on greenhouse gas emissions at the very detailed project level. Not now, but it will be in the future. But this has been adopted now. And the same about subsidies, about reserves and things that were considered totally inactive. So yes, it can be done. And the link between the two is that rather than embracing a very soft version of collective action, where we think that everybody will work together and we have the same aim, different stakeholders. No, we don't. Everybody has their own interests. It's understanding that set of interests and understanding that particularly all the big oil companies were engaged in capture. And therefore we had to think, go back to the very important thing, what's our strategy to counter that specter of capture? No, we're not talking about national level, but even at an initiative level. I think those are lessons, and then I don't want to go much longer there, but it's to put it out there that in terms of the governance action hub and thinking, of course, each context will be different. We need to embrace to a large degree to think about, okay, what are the incentives of each actor in this case, and how do we make it coalesce and get to some compromise? Very hard-nosed negotiations will be needed and so on, rather than embracing the notion that I will all be sitting around the table and it's very, very nice and lovely collective action. If that happens, then we don't have everybody in that room.
That's so important, actually, the point, right? Like, because sometimes precisely because we are so committed to the idea of making things happen. When we are trying to make things happen, we're trying not to necessarily like upset people, right? Like, or have conflict like in the conversations, when conflict in different interests are part of the thing. I mean, like, precisely. And I truly believe that it's like in the world that we're doing, the next challenge is going to be truly effective, to be able to be more inclusive, but that means also like broadening this coalition work. Not being afraid of conflict, even though it may actually derail or it may actually take longer to achieve things, right? Like, but hopefully what we are doing by doing that is precisely like motivate more lasting also action, like something that people can commit to over time. This is very important, Danny. I have two more very quick questions, right? Like, we were talking about EITI, we're talking about energy transition as a standard. Like, would you say that state capture is part of the reason why our reaction to climate change that has been in the conversation, there has been quite slow, to be very honest, or like pushback?
Sure. By the way, just to dovetail on what you said and what we just discussed on the EITI, not only in the new standard, there are very important additional components and and requirements on energy transition, but they are on anti-corruption and on gender empowerment, which all of those were considered unthinkable a few years back. So yes, it can be done. Now, regarding state capture,
State capture in climate change.
in climate change, absolutely. Just to be clear, and that has been part of the confusing evolution of the notion. When we started talking about state capture in shaping the rules of the game, it was by the extremely unduly influential non-state actor. Okay, that was basically what we developed with Joel Hellman. And over time, this has been broadened, and political scientists have embraced the notion that can happen also by politicians and by state leaders. So in some sense, we meant by state capture is capture of the state by non-state actors. But they also can be captured by the state. If, like the case of Putin is emblematic, and what's happening with Orban and other such cases around the world. Now, that's fine. And in fact, in an initiative that you are supporting, I'm engaged in coming up with an index of state capture for the whole world, including both capture of the state and capture by the state. But it's very important to distinguish between the two notions and the two regimes, because the implications for strategy and policy are vastly different. What do you do with a state leader, with a Putin who has captured, versus what you do with ExxonMobil and so on. So those are completely different type of issue. Now, obviously, in natural resource space, the notion of state capture is absolutely critical to understand what are the obstacles for the energy transition. Let's mince no words, and it was so clear in our negotiations regarding the new standard. Industry in natural resources is very heterogeneous, like civil society is heterogeneous, governments are heterogeneous, all states are more heterogeneous within. The mining companies, with a few exceptions, were very progressive and were our allies. The oil companies were divided. The big oil basically was very resistant, and it still is, and they do engage in certain tactics and strategies that could be considered capturing them. I mean, they do join some of these initiatives. Chevron, by the way, just decided to leave the ATI, and that's a sign of the times. Some of these big oil companies are taking their gloves off right now and saying, okay, energy transition, and we'll invest in renewables and blah, blah, blah. But we are not really seriously getting out of fossil fuels, right? And that some are saying it very frankly and transparently, and good for them. In some sense, Chevron leaving, it is a transparent move than greenwashing those that don't do that. Others don't do it. To understand that, because this whole notion and literature on state capture is extremely important, because it poses a huge obstacle. And that's also a message for the larger world and for the donor community, which often says, no, we're not working on natural resources anymore. Now we're only working on climate change or Ukraine or whatever the fact of the moment is. When in fact, arguably, there's no more important thing for climate change than to solve the governance problem in natural resources, precisely because of what we're talking about. If we don't unlock the real obstacles to the energy transition, which reside with governance and state capture, the progress, we're not going to get there. Forget 1.5, even 2 degrees. So I think we need the natural resource governance community needs to make a better case as to the absolutely intimate linkage between both. It's not either or. We're not going to get there if we don't address governance.
Thank you, Danny. We're almost out of time, but just wanted to ask you, like, any recommendation, particularly for the work that not only us from the Action Hub, but it's like also many of our colleagues that are here or online, like could, should, be looking at particularly at the country level in terms of engagement.
So you mean like country examples?
Yeah, or recommendations in any case of how to approach the board. You actually talk about collaboration, right? Like how collaboration is really a serious thing, right? Especially if we want to do it. But it may be actually difficult to actually like launch and do it precisely because we are typically bounded by like the limits of our project, the time frames that we may have.
Right.
But these processes may actually take longer than that we wish or expect.
Processes do always take longer than we think, and than any political or funding sector. So that's very important. I think it's very important to think about a basket of diverse countries and some will be much higher risk but higher reward, and others not so much. Of course, I'm biased. My own country is Chile. And Chile could be a fascinating case, perhaps, to work with. I'm heading to Chile in a few days to a conference and to work there, and it's related to also lithium and so on. Chile is joining the EITI finally. Now, I think the biggest deal, and of course, I'm an arrogant Chilean, the biggest deal about Chile joining is the contribution that these countries can make to the field, rather than the way around. So to work with some of these countries, which in many ways are showing the art of the possible in the South, and have South-South collaboration and South-South lessons is very important. And I think, of course, Chile has hiccups, so it's far from perfect and so on, but it's at a different place totally nowadays, thanks to good policies matched with natural resources, as opposed to most other natural resource rich countries. But then we cannot avoid thinking, well, why not at the right moment also engage with the Ukrainians of this world, or even Lebanon? There's many potential collaborators and fantastic people and institutions in those very, very difficult settings that I think should be also tapped and helped. And last but not least, to engage with some of these international initiatives. I know that you're already very much working with EITI and considering how to help in that. So there you can cover more countries, but also in the context of now the implementation of this very ambitious new standard. The new standard for EITI was just adopted. Implementation would be a matter.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Danny. Let me just quickly check. Do we have any questions in the room first that you would like to follow up with Danny about this issue? Leon.
I'm taking myself for the question. Hi, I'm Leon Miller, and I am a program director at R4D, and happy to collaborate on the Governance Action Hub. And my question is, you talked about, state capture, and we work with a lot of civil society organizations at R4D and in the work I do, and other partners. And what about elite capture when you're engaging with local partners and civil society organizations? It can be very hard to make sure that you are really kind of reaching, collaborating with, empowering, you mentioned gender empowerment with underrepresented groups, be that women, youth, any marginalized group, and that can vary by country by country. And then you mentioned greenwashing, and then the existence of we call astroturf organizations, right? So that's another issue. So, and I'm very interested in particular in issues around gender and gender-based violence. And so how, what have you seen as good or not so successful approaches to ensuring that, yes, we want collaboration, we want to work with local partners, but how do you know that you, especially as an outside maybe group coming in or a collaborator, that you really are reaching those partners and those voices? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, some of the answer you and Mario, Gina, and company I know I've been working on and have many examples. We did something similar many years ago when we started to complement these broad indicators around the world, which I was the person saying, this is a first cut and this is useful to monitor and to compare, but it doesn't help. Within the country, what do they do about it? So basically an approach was created of in-country, country-led by all stakeholders getting together and say how we're going to diagnose the very specific challenges we have. People were working for months around different tables of different issues, representing the localities, representing all kinds of groups, and coming up with some action plan. And that's done more nowadays. That's not universal yet, but basically much more of the bottom up and recognition that you need to embrace the part, because otherwise the so-called INGO capture, basically, I think there has been enough pushback and recognition that ought not to happen. And part of your program that I think everybody will talk about, you're going to talk about in the next few hours, is to go to the locality and start with the bottom up. So I think we need to keep it up to the mind, and that the notion of elite capture is absolutely right. If we were here until midnight and we want to talk all the time about state capture, I'll welcome that some other day, and I'll voice my opinion about other related notions of capture, including, I think, because I'm very interested in psychology, the notion of cognitive capture. What happened in Wall Street and the Wall Street crash and the financial crash was both state capture, but the cognitive capture of how the old boys network function in Wall Street and so on, the hubris and so on. It's at the military intelligence level, which is being discussed now, that can also happen. So there are all kinds of related notions that I'm glad that you brought up, elite capture and so on, that it's part of that, the broader dimensions of this concept.
Thank you very much. We're out of time, but I wanted to acknowledge one question, particularly on political economy analysis that came out, right? Like, and we'll talk a little bit about this also, right? Like political economy analysis, particularly that leads to action. But Danny, I just wanted to acknowledge your time and thank you for coming and sharing these ideas with us. Of course, other people here during the coffee break and online can send us questions for later. We'll be happy to follow up with Danny on an answer about many of those. But for now, if you can help me just thank Danny with. So of course, we're behind. That happens, right? And right now, what I'm gonna do is like, I'm gonna talk to you a little bit about, well, what is it going actually? To most of you, we have been having like one-on-ones or conversations about this in the past few months. Things have changed also, like our changing has evolved based on, should I go here? Thank you. That's fine, that's fine. That's fine. Can you hold that for 1 second? Hold it right here, right below. I'm here. Yeah, okay. Yeah, we're having some issues there, but it's fine. Got it here. Perfect. So we're gonna talk a little bit about like the Governance Action Hub, what it is, right? Like why we started it, how this came from a very basic concept and learning from our past work, and the past work, for example, that R4D has been doing in other areas in some of the sectors like health, education, nutrition, but also like in Amanda Folsom is going to join us in the panel later around the work on collaborative learning. And I apologize because I'm probably going to have to move around like doing it that way. You don't have to be subject to my face for 20 minutes. And Liz, you're going to help me with the PowerPoint, right?
I am, yes.
If you can just share it. Yeah, so like if you just see a green wall when I start moving, apologize, you're gonna see me in the other camera, I guess, in any case. let me start by asking you something, right? Like, if you actually have the opportunity of start over, right, in the work that you are doing, if you knew before starting a project the kind of things that you know now that you are 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years into it, almost at the end, right? Like maybe facing an evaluation, like what would you do different? In many ways, this has represented for us as a team as an opportunity, right? Like to try to do things different. And I have to say, right, like the vision that we present, right, like that is going to be the basis of this conversation, of this presentation, right? It's very ambitious, and I'm not gonna like say that it's not ambitious. Hopefully, it will be audacious, right? Like going beyond ambition. Hopefully, we'll also stay humble, right? In a way that allows us to, over time, be able to listen, right? Not only to you, our partners, right, here in Washington, which we are always eager and looking forward to discuss, like with and so, but precisely the people that we are, that we intend to support, serve, like be useful, right? Like in the end, we want this initiative to be useful. And we are lucky, right, that we count with initial support for part of this vision, right, from a donor like BHP Foundation that allows us like to be creative and think differently, right, about this. Hopefully we can like respond to that confidence, not only from them, but also from the people and organizations that we're going to be working with over the next few years. Next slide. Thank you. We talk about exploring together what is possible in governance action and reforms, and Danny has been mentioned this in the past. And maybe let's go to the next one already, please. Why do we call ourselves Governance Action Hub? Right, like we say that we are a space aspiring to connect different people and different networks. Right, that's what we mean by a hub. Focus on targeted action that complements or strengthens existing efforts, and that understands governance as the ecosystem needed to achieve common, desirable societal goals. And what you see on the right on that slide is actually information that is that exists on the website of the OpenGov Hub, this very same place, right? Like this place actually started under the premise that any social reform is far too complicated for any single organization to tackle alone. Partially, among many other dynamics, of course, right? It's not only the complexity of the issue, but sometimes that is compounded by capture, right? Like in the way that Danny was describing before. This place, the OpenGov Hub, founded in 2012, to break through traditional silos between different sectors and organizations and to catalyze sharing and collaboration needed to rise the global challenges of our time. We would like to do something similar, right? Like, but like maybe we will not be able, right, like to have like physical hubs in the different places where we work. That is not the goal. People have asked me in the past, but is this going to be a physical hub or not? But also in a way, by doing this, responding to the need that is out there to be more flexible and remote, to be able to garner different support from different types of organizations, from different expertise, from different donors, right? Like to respond to specific needs and to be able to support local ideas. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that anymore. Leaf, can you move to the next one? Yes, we need bold thinking, we need audacious ideas, right? But most of the time we acknowledge also that those ideas that may lead to actual change are not ours, right? What you see on the right is actually like the first diagnosis that our senior fellow Katherine Bain, together with Tom Aston, who has been supporting us, and hopefully Tom, you are connected to, like told us clearly after a very comprehensive like set of interviews with different stakeholders at the country level, but also at the global level, right? Like the kind of things that we have here an opportunity to be and to do, particularly locally, right? Build on existing coalition efforts. You're gonna see me and hear me and everybody in the team like repeat this, right? Like we're not here to reinvent something. We're actually trying to see and answer first the question, how can we help support making things better, right? Rather than trying to reinvent them necessarily. Support priorities and agendas driven by local stakeholders in coalitions, right? Like what are the ideas that are coming out to tackle specific challenges from collaborative efforts at the local level, right? When I talk about the local level, we may be talking about the subnational level, and there may be opportunities to do that. Also, sometimes it makes sense to start the conversation at the national level. We're open. But despite that, we would like to explore and prioritize first, right? Some engagement at the subnational level, simply because we see a very strong gap there, right? And because many times in our own projects, and we have been there in the past, right? Like we haven't had like the flexibility or the possibility of exploring the subnational level because we either believe or bet, right, that action at the national level may be actually more impactful because it may reach like a larger set of people, right, and population potential. How do we facilitate collective searching for answers, ideas, and useful approaches? We do see in our engagement, and we have been seeing it over the last few years, that local stakeholders want to be part of the solution, which is a bit contrary to what we may actually have been seeing in past years in terms of like what happens with participatory approaches or participatory platforms, right? Like sometimes people participate initially on them and then they just go away. Sometimes not understanding enough why is that happening, right? Like we are giving you the platform, we're supporting this platform, this space. Why are you not seizing it? And we forget also that there are also things like local politics, that there are certain things as capture at the local level. There are things like civil society failures too, right? I remember many years ago, working at the World Bank, this paper precisely was like, does participation work, with this big title, which obviously attract a lot of attention. But the key point was not to just say participation works or not. It's just that we should be aware also how complicated working together is also for local stakeholders. How do we not only enable inclusive spaces to exchange learning and practical ideas to inform more effective collective action? And how to proactively recruit new voices into existing collective efforts to make them more inclusive and representative. Think here, for example, the process that everybody talks about localization, right? Like, and the challenges that localization has found in terms of being able to transfer more resources to local organizations. We have heard the words, right? Like we have heard about capacity, absorption, etc. How is it that we are able over time also to identify a larger set of potential benefiters, people and organizations benefiting, right? Like from localization processes. And how that can inform in turn the strategies from people like us and also from donors. So next slide, we tend to just press the button. So I'm just gonna give you like a few slides here. I have a bunch of very fancy graphs, right? Like that probably you're not gonna pay full attention to them. You're not gonna be able to read what is like in the small cap over there. I'm still gonna play them in a moment, but I just need you to focus on the next 3 slides. Okay, 4. Okay. And then you can relax a little. I'm gonna try to attempt to answer 3 questions, okay? Why a governance action hub? Right. How is it that we plan to respond to that reason, right? And a few indications on what is it that we're gonna do at least first, right? Fast forward, like what we are gonna be doing is not necessarily what we are gonna be doing for the next 5 years, because the whole point is like, how do we learn through this journey about what is useful, right? In terms of actually make things happen. And that may change over time too, and that's perfectly fair. Why a governance action hub? We believe the governance challenges we face call for a reconsideration of our strategies. Not now and once and for all, but regularly. And at the center of that rethinking is the agency of local stakeholders, engaging them in the solution of the challenges they face. This is not about capacity actually I try to avoid the word capacity, right? Even though it is very important, right? Like it is extremely important and it's at the center many times. But we're trying to like focus on the word agency, right? Like it's capacity for something, capacity that stays. Now, next slide. How will we do it? Now, we decided, right, and this was a conscious choice, something that not necessarily is going to be what responds fully to the why, but is the way that we want to start, okay? Strengthening collective action strategies, right? Like understanding what is out there, what seems to be working, right? Better. How come those efforts be more effective over time? What are the bottlenecks? How is it that we move forward with this whole like collective action discussion around alliances, collaborative work, coalitions for change, all these different iterations of collective action that we always keep in mind we talk about? What are the technology solutions that may actually support that kind of work over time? What is the impact, right, that efforts like many of you are actually leading out there are happening? Can we test something slightly different and see if things take us further, right? In terms of both impact, but also sustainability of the results. How do we elevate, and this is part of the strategy for us, is how do we over time are able to elevate and support local stakeholder ideas for concrete challenges that they face, for challenges that are important to them? How do we promote in this process cross-learning? Cross-learning could be between different types of stakeholders, right? In forming like local strategies. We're doing something like this, for example, in Peru, right? Like in Miguel Cervantes is going to talk a little bit about that later. But also between countries and between us. Because like the truth is like, sometimes we talk about collaboration and collective action, but we are not able many times to do it enough and consistently enough. Is there a room to actually test something different? And we will have a call for partnerships that is coming later in the presentation. And finally, how do we facilitate that coordination of local and global action? I mean, like, this is just finding ways, right? Like, is it that in the engagement of local stakeholders, we're able to call attention from certain or a few international partners that may be able to, one, strengthen the idea and raise the stakes for participation of local stakeholders initially, but also to be able to inform their own strategies of how they can support those local communities. The next generation of work for many of you, if you want. Next slide, please. Now, what will we do, right? Like when you start thinking like, okay, this is how we're doing, this is how we are responding to this need of putting like the ideas of people first, like putting people at the center of the action, right? We're gonna have two lines of work mainly. One is gonna be focused on country work, right? We'll talk a little bit about that, like where, how, like what kind of collaborations we can look for, right? And also like a bit of a global community. We're calling it a global community. Then this has to do with also there's a big discussion about content, a global community. But what is this about? The idea is that how is it that we identify things, right? Like that, like ideas that people are eager to actually convey, right, to potential partners, international or national, right? And being able to broker, if you want, to connect those ideas with that potential assistance. That can come from us in terms of capacity, right? Most of the times will be like pool resources or collaborations with partners like you, right? Like in the sense that we will be able in certain geographies, right, to identify how is it that we can work together towards raising the profile of some of these local ideas to tackle concrete challenges. Like, how do we take models like, for example, like corruption, right? Like the grand challenge in competitions, where we are able to gather and create incentives for some of these ideas to come out. But how is it that we're able to make also those ideas clearer, like larger, garner more attention in a more organic way, right? That can become potentially even a marketplace for ideas in this sense. how is it that we provide, and the kind of things that we're gonna do is like provide opportunities for proof of concept. Some of these ideas that we're gonna be identifying in our engagement, right? Like we're actually gonna provide some funding, some flexible funding for testing and proof of concept. But always with the idea not only to just generate a nice report, but how do we connect that proof of concept with the opportunity for scalability or adaptability, right? Depending on what makes more sense. And finally, it's this visibility in the end, right? And it has to do with what is the incentive in any case for a local organization to participate, right? Like many times, especially when efforts in the past may not have necessarily responded to their needs, is precisely gathering that visibility, right? That profile and the opportunity to be part of those conversations with other stakeholders that may actually make things happen. We believe that there's a lot of room to try this. Next slide, just to summarize. Thank you. In a nutshell, okay? We believe in the need for a platform to constantly explore what is possible in governance action. Agile, able to test new ways to empower local stakeholders and inform the strategies of global initiatives and donors, among others. We will start by focusing on collective action strategies to make them broader, stronger, and action-oriented, right? Our work will include deep dive work in countries that are demand and partnership driven. This work will be demand and partnership driven, and a global community connecting local ideas to tackle concrete challenges with the resources needed to make them happen. In this way, what we aspire to do is to foster a virtuous circle of better governance, better development outcomes, and trust between local stakeholders. Next slide. Just wanted to give you like a sense of people that are working and supporting us so far. The team obviously is going to change over time, it's going to grow. This kind of agenda cannot be done alone. There is a team that works in different parts of the world, but we will operate very much through partnerships, local and global. But I just wanted to acknowledge the work and the brain thrust and the commitment of this very diverse team from all over, right, that are actually part of this governance action hub. Next slide, please. Our initial focus, right, is going to be on a few specific governance challenges in resource-rich countries with the possibility of adapting our approach to other challenges over time. There are three types of challenges, right? And I recognize that this division may seem a bit artificial, right? But it's helpful just to organize, right? Like we talk about energy transition and climate change a moment ago, right? Like we are, that is the emerging challenge that we're probably going to be focusing more in the beginning. But these emerging challenges, as we were mentioning before, is also a catalyzer, but also is going to reflect a lot of the problems with our approaches in the past, right? The consequences of work that we have done or not done in the past, right? Like they are persistent challenges. How is it, for example, that in a context of climate action, we have these just energy transition partnerships, for example, with certain countries with huge amounts of money, like being available for energy transition, right? How is it that we secure that there is more accountability about those funds than what has happened in the past, for example, with, say, mining revenue, oil revenue, etc. management. And then you have underlying contextual challenges that we need to acknowledge, right? And if you want, shield, prepare, adapt, like these collective action for. And that includes corruption, it's the capture, weak social contracts also that limit the potential impact of what we're doing. Next slide. I'm not going to go into details of why is it that we are deciding at this point to work on resource-rich countries, right? Like, but it just comes to like say that because of the work that we did with Brookings over the last few years, we have learned a lot, right? Like all the perceptions from local stakeholders about fragmented social contracts, this transaction-based dialogue between stakeholders in low-trust environments, this corruption and poor governance that have in ways been normalized, right? And reform pessimism, which is something that we're talking about with Danny. And how traditional TAP approaches, transparency, accountability, and participation, to governance and anti-corruption reform have had mixed results and rarely result in system level changes. Right? We want in the end, like in being small and nimble, right, to try to explore the art of the possible in terms of governance action and reform. How is it that we explore the frontiers of that? And we need you. We need the people and organizations that work at the local level, right? Like we need that engagement. We need to find ways to include them in the conversation, right? We need to show that the way that we're trying to do things with you and others, right, can actually lead to something. And for that, you need proof. You need to generate results. You need to gather interest. You need to build that credibility on a new or an existing program, right? Like, and even if you may feel good about your results on average, right? Like, ask yourself a question: if you could do something better to strengthen your impact, and potentially to generate more sustainability for that impact, wouldn't you want to try it? We want to explore that question. Next slide, please. We talk about these lines of work. I'm not going to go into that. We're almost running out of time and we have to go for coffee. But so Liv, I'm going to ask you to pass for one more because there are like 2 slides more that I wanted to show. Next one. I told you, fancy graphs. We can share this with you. Transforming local dynamics, right? What is our bet? What are the assumptions that we have behind the work? It's all outlining over here, and we'll be talking about this in blogs, analysis, and one-on-one conversations with you. Next slide. Now, how will we work with you? How is it that we're planning to do this? Right? Like there are 4 core ideas that we're going to be talking about over the next few weeks, directly with you, but also in the countries that we're going to start visiting for scope. Next slide. First, where will we work? Right? Like we actually have like a proof of concept kind of work that we started. Like we didn't plan for it, but it's like it has informed a lot of the design of our program that we started in Peru. So we're going to be taking it to the next level. Miguel is going to be talking a little bit about that in the panel. But in general, selection of countries that we will work with, we want it to be very like strongly based on the interests of local stakeholders and coalitions, and with local and global partnerships secured. We don't want to go alone. It doesn't make sense for us to try to go alone and just push and try to prove like that we are relevant. Right? We actually want to work in places, right, and with partners, right, that are interested to explore also what is possible, right? How can we take things for them? We will prioritize opportunities for pool funding or in-kind collaborations with other interested parties as part of the projects that exist, right? International cooperation, in government, private sector, or civil society. We have a few examples also like this in Moquegua, actually, that Miguel can actually propose, like an interesting, like a set of opportunities that have been opened by building this space, this safe space to talk among different types of stakeholders, including some of that may not be used to actually be in the same room. A first set of countries of our scoping has been identified, right? Like we have been doing our homework. I just wanted to be clear about that. But with plans for a first scoping in the Philippines before the end of the year, we're just setting that up. And as I was saying, we will build on our experience in Peru, where a first proof of concept of the model started last year. Liv. Thank you. Yes, next slide. Call for partnerships. Okay, so we hope that you can stay tuned for our first open call for partnerships. Global and local initiatives and organizations interested in exploring together new avenues, joint value propositions, right, for even business development or spot-on collaborations, right? We are interested in securing the work we embark on is useful and used by stakeholders that adapt the approach or inform their own strategies. That's what we're interested in, what we're going to prioritize first. And we hope to find a way also that for those partners interested in working with us, to be engaged in the governance structure and the strategizing of the Action Hub over the next few years. Next slide. There will be an exercise that will start like really soon, actually starting next week, where we will be doing mapping or identification of existing information on coalition work, global, and in selected geographies. We are interested in engaging organizations with deep knowledge of network efforts among civil society, private sector, research and academia, and government agencies across or within countries. Themes like climate action and energy transition will be of particular interest, especially at first. But again, we are also interested in exploring some of those legacy challenges, things that are unresolved, that are still making things not happening. Next slide, please. Thank you for this. The audacity challenge, right? This identification of all ideas from grassroots initiatives, what it's like, pitches and competitions. How is it that we are able to, provided that we overcome privacy considerations and issues, of course, right? Like be able to raise the profiles of many of those ideas. But it's not just like, hey, people, please give us your ideas. No? Like this has to be better framed. So people actually love the opportunity, right? Like in working with existing global initiatives in coordinating each of these challenges. We can be talking about a thematic challenge, right? Like one focus on climate action and just energy transition. We can be talking about a challenge that addresses these issues more in depth in a particular country or group of countries. In a few cases, right, many of these promising ideas, we will be able to explore some funding for proof of concept. Next slide, please. In general, what do we feel at this point that is different about this, right? Like we focus more on how can stakeholders contribute to make existing efforts work better. We promote when possible facilitate an enabling environment for collective action to be more effective and inclusive. We show what is possible and actively work with local and global actors to facilitate embeddedness in institutionalization. You can read through the slides, all right? We are not saying that we're going to get it right every single time. We are not saying that we're going to save international development, right? Like, despite the fact that we may want to do a lot over here. But the point is that not to do a lot in a big scale. We cannot do it. Because first of all, we cannot do it at all by ourselves. We need your help. We need to work with others. That's the whole point of this. What we want in the end is to show what is possible, even if it is on a small scale first, but with the idea and the prospect also always to connect that conversation, that emphasis, that initiative, right, with the possible actors that can actually adapt that to a different place or a different setting, right? Or that may be able actually to take those learnings into their own studies. In the end, we want to be useful, we want to explore what is possible. Thank you very much for your time. In a moment, we're going to stop, and I guess that we're going to go for a coffee break. During the coffee break, please, just approach us, members of the team, if you have questions about the initiative. We're going to have a space as part of like the whole panel discussion too, and after the panel discussion, to talk more about this and hear your reactions. But for now, we are very excited about this. We're very thankful that you are here with us today, being remotely or in person. And we're going to take a break for those of you online for the next 10 to 12 minutes, right? And then we'll come back with a final panel. We're going to be talking about these issues precisely. Thank you very much. Please enjoy.
Okay.
I would prefer you not to do it. I am confused that good job.
All right, thank you. All right, good morning, everybody, and thanks for coming back in. My name is Bain. I'm a senior fellow with the R4D team working on the Governance Action Hub, and it's my pleasure to facilitate this panel. The panel is building on this morning's session. And as Mario's clearly laid out, we are looking for all the advice we can get on how to be courageous and how to learn from other people in this field. The urgency of the matters at hand is very clear, and we have set out, Mario's presented this morning, some good hypotheses about how we think we should be working differently. But we're very aware that we are not the only people in this space. And I'm delighted on the panel this morning that there are at least 4 people who know more about this than I do. So thank you all very much for participating. And the panel this morning is a chance for us to now get quite specific about what are some of the things we should all be doing as a community differently, how we do that, with whom, how do donors actually walk the walk on this, so that we can really become audacious and learn together as a global community. We have 2 people online who are panelists, Amanda and Miguel. Welcome, both of you. And I want to be very clear to the participants online. I'm sorry we haven't come to you yet, and I will make sure that our further questions and interaction during this session is with you. Okay. So I'm going to start with Jean. Thanks for being with us. Jean is co-CEO of Accountability Lab, and I think the Accountability Lab needs no extra introduction. It's everywhere. It's doing great work, and I'm thrilled. It even has a foot in the OGP now. All good stuff. So I'm thrilled to have Jean on the panel with us. And I was delighted, Jean, when I was doing my research before this session, that the Accountability Lab has become quite involved with working with coalitions as part of their strategy. And given that that's part of our strategy, I wondered if you could lay out for us a bit of what you understand to be coalitions, and how you support them. We've had a lot of language thrown around this morning: networks, partnerships, collaboration, multi-stakeholder groups, social movement. These are all quite different things. What is it that's different about coalitions? What does the Accountability Lab understand by them, and how do you support them?
Big question. Yeah, I think going back to what you were saying is, there's social movements, there's all these bits and pieces, and these sort of types of coalitions. I think at the lab, we're really focused on building, creating, and supporting what we call unmapping networks. So essentially bringing in networks of people that are engaged in issues like we're talking about, so whether it be governance, human rights, democracy, peace building, education, whatever, but who are very often left out of the conversation. So because they are young, or they're marginalized, or they're women in a man's space, or they're artists, or they're creators, or they're designers, or they're thinkers, or they're writers, or they're poets. Mm-hmm. And I think because often what the assumption is that our space is it's filled with lots of big words and PowerPoints and things that create exclusionary spaces. And what we're trying to do is make them inclusive and sort of crowd people in to the conversation, which we think makes conversations richer. It makes them, well, not only more inclusive, but it makes them richer. It makes the solutions more palatable and more, sort of possible, I think, for more people. And so for us in particular, we have done this through our Voice to Rip programs, where we've created music programs for young people to chat about or to engage on an issue like elections or peace building or COVID, make music about them, being trained, take on some training around social accountability issues. So not only how to make really good music, but also, about the topics themselves, bringing then that music into the space and saying, okay, well, hey, here's some people who have some really good ideas about these things. Should we be considering them? And bringing people onto an equal footing. So it's just because you're a musician doesn't mean you're less able to make a meaningful contribution to a conversation about elections in Liberia than a PhD in elections in Liberia.
Mhm.
And then I think sort of integrity icon, which is our campaign to name and fame honest civil servants. That's also, you know, creating spaces for people to engage in what a civil service needs to look like, not just for politicians and for the public service to talk about the public service, but also for ordinary people to talk about what integrity and good governance means. And then bringing them in, crowding them into a sort of a level playing field with public servants to say, hey, these are the things I really like. These are the things that I don't like. These are the things that have been really great in my community. Can we do more of those? And then finally, our civic action teams, which I know we're going to chat a little bit about later, which is about creating citizen feedback mechanisms with power holders, whether they be in the public sector or the private sector, so that you're then again crowding in voices that are very often misheard and or not included or represented by somebody else.
Interesting. So for the Accountability Lab, coalitions is more an approach,
Yeah,
kind of crowding in and making sure spaces are inclusive.
very much so.
I'm wondering whether that, could one say as a critic, and let me be devil's advocate, that leads to a lot of talk shops. The idea of crowding in people and creating a lot of space for diverse voices, I think, is an excellent one. But evidence might suggest that that makes it more difficult for people to come to consensus and actually shift change. Give us some examples of how crowding in voices and having an equity focus can also help in improving specific policies and nudging change.
So I am South African. I love a good workshop. No, I mean, I think that, like, honestly, conversation, like, we can never underestimate the power of creating space for everyone's voice to be heard. Granted, this isn't at the exclusion of getting things done. And we're very focused on getting things done, in particular because we work with young people and young people want to get things done. But I don't want to discount the idea of getting things done. However, I think, you know, when you're looking at impact, if you think of something like through our CIVEX program, which is the Citizen Voice program, where we train community journalists to engage on specific issues, specific accountability issues, they engage community members, sort of both collect information from community members about challenges they have, but also feed back information to community members and say, hey, you're not the only one who's struggling with this issue. There are 65% of this community is also struggling. So let's speak with one voice about this issue to power holders. And actually what that has meant is that in places like Zimbabwe, we've managed to reinstate trash collection in Bulawayo. In other parts of Zimbabwe, we've managed to work with the public and private sector to essentially get a private sector company to withdraw its bid to purchase a wetland, because a bunch of young people were like, hey, I'm not the only one that's concerned about this issue. Let's band together and create a coalition to work on this. And then I think, you know, in places like Nepal, we've been working on migration and creating opportunities for women to talk about their experience around migration, whether it be them being migrants and things got really dangerous and hard, and they've returned, and or their partners have left for in many cases for decades of time and can't access specific services from government. And it's a different conversation when you're speaking in coalition with others about something. If you are someone who traditionally doesn't have a voice, then you're just alone saying, hey, I have a problem. But if you're saying, hey, here's me and my 75% of my community that has this problem, it's sort of, you know,
Empowering.
empowering.
That's great.
together.
So there's power in broadening the conversation, but it can also lead to a different type of solution and to change.
100%. And I think it depends on how you do what you do with it, right? And are you extracting information from communities by saying, let's have a talk shop and let's talk some more, and I'm going to write some notes, and they're never going to share these notes with anyone ever, except I'm going to show my boss's boss to say that I had 25 people at my workshop. Good job, me.
Yeah.
Or are we going to say, hey, community, can we work with you to develop some speaking notes at the end of the conference? I promise we will create some speaking notes for everyone, and we will work with community members to engage with power holders in safe, constructive spaces.
Right.
That is our promise to the space.
Yeah, that's a great transition. I wanted to ask you one last question before I turn to some of the other panel members. But Accountability Lab, like many other INGOs, is talking the talk on locally led development, which I think is great. But you guys are quite a long way down along this journey, I think, and it would be really, I think, helpful for us to learn from you on how we actually do locally led development as an INGO that's holding the money from the donor, who's BHP. So you've talked about the local leadership and about accompanying people on their journey. How would you square that circle as an INGO based in DC?
So we're not an INGO.
You're not. What are you?
We're what we call a translocal network. So we are a network of 12 local organizations that work collectively with one strategy and one vision and mission. But how we do that is very different. Each lab is led by, so I'm, for example, co-CEO with my colleagues Sherry and Blair of AL Global. I am not the boss of AL Nepal. I have no ability to affect what they do. I cannot tell them how they spend their money. I cannot tell them how they fundraise. The great part of being a translocal network is that we get to share a ton of learning. So we can try something out in South Africa and say, oh gosh, that worked really well. Should we try that out in Nigeria? Here's the mistakes that we made, and we can create those sort of intentional spaces to engage. The other thing is we get to share resources. I think anybody that works with an organization assumes expensive. MailChimp is expensive. I mean, these sound very simple things, but we're a very simple organization. And those things are expensive, right? Like, 25 Microsoft Word things. But if we can share resources together and we can say, get one big Zoom account that everyone works off, or one MailChimp, or one, comms team that is based in Johannesburg, isn't that so much more powerful than each organization trying to find some expert in USAID contracting? We only need one, and we can sort of share that information between everyone. I think our learning is more powerful. I think our innovation is more powerful. Every person that works at the lab is from the place in which they live. Ironically, except for AL Global, but AL Global is not DC. It is genuinely global. We have someone in Mali, we have someone in different parts of the world. And so that's why we're called AL Global. And I think the other thing, but I think that being translocal is hard and it requires a lot of intentionality, and it's part of this conversation around talk shops. Are we talk shopping, or are we actually genuinely connecting once a week or once every 2 weeks between the comms team and the programs team and the strategic team and the fundraising team, and actually talking about where we're at and what we've learned this week and where we're going? Does that take a ton of time? Yes, but we found that actually those meaningful connections are the thing that makes the translocal network work.
Super helpful, because as Mario presented, one of our 2 action areas is building this global community, and really taking the time to focus on those meaningful interactions, I think is costly and takes a lot of time, but as you're saying, can really be where you get the meat, right? So really interesting.
We wrote a rather underrated, but I think potentially important blog.
She said in a unbiased
way of the fact that accountability is expensive.
Yeah.
And I think we think that being accountable is just being a good person. It's not. It's having the credit card that can get you access to QuickBooks so that you can get audited. It's having the newsletter so that you can tell people how to do it, but you can't have a newsletter. It just takes time if you don't have the equipment, and then you need the equipment, and that costs money. And it's that stuff that people just don't think about.
But it's priceless. Yeah. Great. Thank you, Gina. I'll come back to you. Amanda, I'll turn to you next, if I may. Amanda Folsom is the Senior Director of Collaborative Learning at Results for Development, and has 20 years working in collaborative learning, mainly in the health space. And she's been super important to us as a team as we've been thinking through how we can build on collaborative learning models, including the one that Miguel will talk to us about from Peru, as we develop the Governance Action Hub. And Amanda, you and I have talked a bit, but I wanted you to be able to stay here and hear what the audience thinks too. But a lot of the collaborative learning work that R4D has done has been about opening these spaces, as Jean has talked about, bringing in new voices, but in particular sectors, either governments together or around health issues. I'm wondering how well you think that that type of approach will lend itself to governance issues, which are quite often very complex and not single sector, but also need resolving with multiple perspectives, right? Private sector, civil society, and government. How do you see, what tweaks do you see us having to make in a collaborative learning type approach as we try and learn from you in this Governance Action Hub?
Thank you, Kathy, and congratulations to all on the launch of the Governance Action Hub. I think this is a really important question, and I've enjoyed the discussions we've been having around how collaborative learning networks, which are communities of learning, we've been supporting more than 20 of these over the past 15 years in R4D's history, much in global health, as you said, and increasingly in our education and nutrition practices. And we've been learning a lot, and I'm really excited about the potential for adapting and using this collaborative learning approach in the governance space. And with this complex issue around multi-stakeholder engagement. And I think a lot of what Jean just said about principles for coalitions really apply too to how we think about principles for collaborative learning. I think first off, you've asked the question about the multi-stakeholder groups. And yes, collaborative learning networks often can be composed of different types of change agents that are maybe operating in a similar system, working toward similar goals. And these could be different actors. Like in health, we often are working, as you said, with government, ministries of health, ministries of finance, healthcare providers, like at the primary care level, or associations of providers, civil society organizations, policy research actors. And we have been doing a lot of work with these types of actors who are working on a common goal, like transforming primary health care or moving their countries toward universal health coverage, which is a multi-year long journey and requires multi-stakeholder collaboration. And so we found that these types of collaborative learning networks can work well with certain key ingredients, and I'll touch on that in a moment. We also have done some work with more homogeneous groups of change agents. So it might be that, we're all working with health policy research organizations across multiple countries. They all have similar missions and roles that they play in their systems. And so there's some kind of common issues they're facing in their disciplines and work. And so we found that both types of groupings can work, but they do require some tailored approaches for sure around stakeholder engagement. So I'm really pretty optimistic that communities of learning and collaborative learning can be applied. I think the first reason why is that learning as an endeavor can be kind of a disarming first step, I think, to help diffuse some of the power dynamics. And then the learning can later lead to more radical collaboration, collective action. And if the base is learning and some of the key ingredients and principles are there, that can, over time, start to lead toward that more radical collaboration. I think what's really important for multi-stakeholder groups for collaborative learning is that there is a common challenge and a sense of shared purpose that all the stakeholders care about. That there is a safe space for learning where there's trust and mutual accountability within the group. There's recognition that each participant in the community has a role to play and brings valuable experience and knowledge to the table. We often say that everyone has something to share and something to learn. So we're creating, similar to coalitions, that level playing field. And very importantly, there's neutral and skilled facilitation to enable the learning process. That facilitation needs to be understanding of the power dynamics, the political economy factors at play, and can foster conditions of safe space and trust building and relationship building to enable that collaborative learning. So those are some of the essential ingredients we've found to be really important for effective collaborative learning networks across multiple sectors. And we've recently put forward a toolkit and some online learning modules that kind of outline some of these key ingredients in more detail, and would be happy to share more of that.
Yeah, thank you, Amanda. And I do recommend the toolkit. It's absolutely excellent, and people do check it out if you haven't seen it. I'll come to Miguel in a minute to get some examples. So I think Peru and the example that Miguel's been involved in is a really good example of what you're saying, Amanda, of applying the community of learning approach to a very difficult community that suffered through extraction processes in Peru. And we'll get some examples from him. But before I go on to that, I wanted to ask you a question about learning too, because as part of the design team on the Governance Action Hub, we've been really trying to think about how we can be meaningful in our learning approach. And context really matters on everything, right? But on governance particularly, context really matters. There's no point really pairing Nigeria with I don't know, Dominican Republic to learn from each other in many ways, right? Because of the administrative structure, the political economy, etc. What sort of, I mean, your team has been particularly good at creating regional and global fora where meaningful exchange happens. What is given that we want to kind of shift the power and have the global knowledge come from the local level under the Governance Action Hub, and frankly, I think that's because the best work that's happening is at the local level and at the subnational level. And given that we want to help co-curate that knowledge and put that knowledge back with local partners at the global level, where we all have so much to learn from it, how can we do that in a way that takes stock of context and where we're pairing perhaps countries that have something in common, and where we're creating discussions where people can go home and say, I think I could try that, rather than, oh my God, that would never work because in my country, local government has no power, right? How do you think we can be meaningful about that global learning journey that starts at the local level?
Yeah, thank you. I think to set up a meaningful local to global exchange, I think it's very important to be intentional in, first of all, in how the learning agenda is set, that it is locally driven, demand driven, and really responsive to the needs of local communities. And so that's really important first step in getting a community of learning that's locally driven started. I think facilitation plays an important role in really understanding the needs of the community, listening carefully and actively and continuously listening and adjusting as needed, synthesizing that demand and identifying those areas of commonality that are starting to emerge from community members from very different contexts. And I think through that process of careful listening and demand scoping, we can often find unexpected commonalities, but also some important differences that we have to take into consideration in defining a learning agenda. And the learning agenda, normally, if it's across different contexts, pairing countries from different regions of the world, for example, it can be possible to find areas of commonality. They are actually quite common in many cases, but it really requires drilling down and understanding deeply the issues and the root causes, and trying to get deeper into the issues to really start unpacking and creating a fruitful learning process. I think a second part of that is really ensuring that the question of who is involved is really front and center too in getting a community started, ensuring inclusive spaces, that different types of stakeholders are around the table, as we talked about, and that those are actors that can affect change locally and work together collectively, and can be building on existing local coalitions, and also recruiting and bringing in underrepresented voices. So that, I think, is also really important foundational work in getting a locally driven community started. And then I think finally, to inform global level, it's really important throughout the learning journey And this is, I think, one thing that sets collaborative learning networks that we've been supporting apart from a lot of just peer-to-peer learning workshops that we've all experienced, is that there's a lot of intentionality around capturing the learning into some sort of product that really captures the voices and the tacit or experiential knowledge which exists in the community and can be shared across different contexts and adapted into local contexts. It can also be shared to inform global learning and global action as well, and really brings out the voices and real experiences from different communities. So investing in those products is also really important as part of the process.
Thank you, Amanda. Please stay with us. I'll probably come back to you. Miguel, lovely to see you. I'm sorry you couldn't be here in person. Miguel was meant to travel but was unable, but lovely to have you on the panel. Miguel is the executive director and founder of CCPM in Peru, which is a consultancy group. And Miguel, I wondered if I could start by asking you to tell participants a bit about, because I know you have about 20 years of working in extractive communities in the Andes region. And I think if you haven't worked in the extractive space, it's often quite hard to understand why it's so difficult to embark on a collaborative learning experience, right? So tell us a bit about what you face when you go into an extractive community in terms of the type of social contract, the type of trust there is, the way that people view collaboration and participation, and how they react when you propose that kind of thing.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. I am very glad to be here. As you just said, I'm recovering from a severe flu. This is the reason, because I am not there. Well, regarding your question, yeah, it's difficult to implement or develop mining activities in the Andes, but not just in the Andes. It's a global challenge. It's mining activities is difficult in many regions of the world, particularly in the Andes. But we believe that the problem is not just the weakness of the government. In some cases, it probably is connected with the logic of the business in mining, because it is not it appears to risk. They control a lot of costs. In some of cases, this approach don't allow to understand the context. The main issue is the context. In the Andean region, the context is very complex in general. So in the case of Peru, for the learning community, in Cajamarca, we need to understand at least three elements. In the national context, in Peru, we have 6 presidents in 6 years and 3 Congress. So the instability of the political area is very high, with a distrustful inherent with that situation. On the other hand, we have in Moquegua region, there is a regional context. In the case of Moquegua, it's basically a mining region, but it is a region with a lot of water. It's very dry. It is a continuum of the desert of Atacama. It's a small region with people who mainly live in cities with high level of education. So understand the national context, understand the regional context, and understand the expectative of the different stakeholders is the main consideration for building the community of learning. Because why this is important? Because probably we can, what we are applying in this region is not necessarily applying in other regions. no, in larger region with rural populations, with more water, etc., etc. So our idea in the community of learning and practice in Moquegua is to start to understand as a pilot, what works, and then try to identify the specific components of that experience in order to apply in other regions if it's possible.
That's super helpful. And I wanted to ask you, Miguel, in some ways, I see communities of learning as a kind of first step in coalition building, because as Amanda said, the learning, if it's done in a kind of purposeful way, can become the big equalizer, right? It can put everybody on an equal playing field. And I understand that even in this very difficult context in Peru, with political instability at different levels, communities that have been promised many things and not seen them follow through, this trust building and this learning process has in fact crowded people into a community of learning that's beginning to look like it might provide the foundations for a kind of coalition that can bring around change. Can you tell us a little bit about that process?
Yes. Well, our first step was an interview with the members who participate in a former multi-stakeholder space called REMI. It was that space reunited this stakeholder in order to discuss the vision of the mining in 2030. So we invited these people and interviewed in order to understand what is your vision about the development of the territory. That was the first step, to understand the different visions, understand the interest for this kind of the space, because this space is not a regular multi-stakeholder space in Peru. The multi-stakeholder spaces in mining is regarding negotiation, is regarding crisis, it's not regarding learning. So for them was weird at the beginning, then they understand the process after several meetings, then more organization ask for integrate the community of learning and practice. What is the interest, the main interest of these people? Because the composition, this is the one key issue. No? The Moquegua regional government is part of the community of learning. Major mining companies active in the region are part of the community of learning. Civil society groups such as Poverty Reductions Roundtable and NGOs, Professional Association of Economists and Journalists, Local Development Fund, and academic institutions such as National University of Moquegua. So it is people who are not connected regularly. When they are appearing in one space is for negotiation, we're in a crisis, not for interchange ideas, interchange experiences. Why is important that? Because in the interchange ideas, they have the opportunity to learn to the other, understand the other visions, and build a common ground. It is important in common ground because without that, it is impossible to build a common solution.
Right.
So
and how long does that take, Miguel? I'm just interested in the time frame on that. Building a common ground. Is this something you can do in 3 to 4 weeks, or how long has that process taken?
It's a very good question. You know, building trust and learning are long-term processes. No, in that case, it takes at least 6 months at the beginning to confirm the community of learning. Now, the community of learning has more than a year, no, and there are more organizations that apply to enter to the community of learning and practices. They have a charge of principles. They have working groups even for applying knowledge. One of them is monitoring key regional development indicators. The other is supporting implementation of provincial and district development plan, and etc. So
Right.
currently are working.
Well over a year. Interesting. Well over a year to get the trust and get the structure up and running. Thank you, Miguel. Please stay with us. I may come back to you. Michael, I want to turn to you. Michael Jarvis is the Executive Director of the Transparency and Accountability Initiative, which is a collaborative effort of funders supporting transparency, participation, and accountability around the globe. And we weren't together, we've known each other a long time, but I understand 3 years ago, you were involved in a discussion about the future of the natural resource governance space. And 3 years ago, there were two big conclusions. One, that the connection between global and local actors should be strengthened. And two, that there should be more approaches supporting coalitions for change. How would you rate the progress on those two conclusions over the last 3 years? And we all understand COVID has happened, so you can be easy on yourself.
Thanks, Kathy, and thanks to the R4D team, and congrats on the launch. Yeah, it's a very mixed scorecard, is the headline. I mean, I think there's wonderful work happening through wonderful organizations, both international level, advocacy fronts, local community-based, bits in between. But I think the connections is still very much a work in progress. So there are organizations like Accountability Lab that are taking a different approach from the beginning. It's in their DNA. You've got groups, initiatives like the Ringo, the Reimagining INGO process, and the prototypes they've got going, some of which are quite exciting. But it's certainly not mainstream yet. The rhetoric is mainstream. The action, I'm not sure, is. And I think they're facing, if you look at the natural resource governance space, we're facing a localization challenge, and we're facing the context of how you reframe your work and rethink your work in the context of climate change. And there's an interesting piece in the Financial Times this morning, and Gina laughed because she was teasing me for reading the paper this morning.
Reading a good one.
But there's an opinion piece in there that talks about climate stuckness, which resonated with me this morning. And if you go back to 2015, when the Paris Agreement was set, the share of the global energy mix that comes from oil, gas, and coal was 85%. You know what it is end of 2022? Well, it's
Probably pretty close.
81.8. That's no, like, that was 2015, we're in 2023. And I think some of the institutional statuses, the incentives, the fact there's an imbalance of resources on those making the case for change versus those of vested interest in the status quo, are still hard to shift. And I think you see that in those who are focused on in the extractive sector. And there, I think part of the challenge of building these coalitions and working well effectively is that you have to acknowledge that there are differences of opinion. Like, there are some for whom suddenly any association with oil and gas is toxic. That includes funders who walked away from this space. They can't justify involvement with that space, even though we've still got this huge industry and we need to influence it to be better. And yes, we need to influence it to phase itself out, but the number of negative impacts that can come if you have a race to the bottom and remain oil and gas is significant. So I think organizations that have long worked in the space are struggling with how they talk to that work in a way that can still connect. And then even if you look at, say, the more progressive, for want of a better word, communities, that look at what's happening out in Nevada here in the US. Like, you've got a case of wanting to build a lithium mine, which the federal government is imposing, because there's a huge need for critical minerals and to spur the energy transition. And yet there are indigenous communities who say this is a heritage site. There are environmentalists who are concerned about the impact on the local environment. And you get actually a discord between communities that would have traditionally worked well together. Like, there are those in the environmental field who say net zero is all that matters. We've got to do whatever it has to take to get there, or the whole planet is done for. And then there are those who see it in the context of the local community, and they have rights, and they have, you know, a whole history of caring for that community that they need to be brought together. So it's not a surprise to me that our scorecard is mixed. This stuff is complex and it's tricky. But if you look at, say, the publish what you pay community, some might say, why aren't they being more aggressive on the energy transition? There is no consensus across the different coalitions and country views about what is the right approach on these issues. And we probably need to give a bit more resources to having those hard conversations, finding areas of consensus where we can do it. Because there is great work. Like Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association are doing great things. HODA in Mexico are doing great things. Like this local, the global, back to local, you know, the translocal piece that Gina was talking about can really work, but the sort of starting point of action needs to be embedded in the local context, which is what's exciting about this work. And I always come back to that example, Mario, that you and I both worked on when we were looking at, is in the context of why aren't they using all this extracted data, and particularly in Colombia, you had royalty data that was being published and then turned into saying, this is the amount that should come back to these specific communities. You can submit project ideas to access this money. And they were showing no interest in how much that money was. And we couldn't, why?
Yeah.
We've done all this transparency, we don't know how much, you know why? They knew that the governor had to sign off on whatever projects got approved for that money. And they'd already decided that that was a captured process, and it was not worth their time to go through the headache of writing proposals and submitting project ideas if they weren't ever going to get truly considered. And they were ahead of us. Like, so if you don't have coalitions that understand that political economy perspective, and then think about how that interplays with the regional and global levels, we're not going to get the progress.
Yeah, I think you raise a really good point. I think there's a danger when we use this collaborative learning and even coalitions and kind of movements and participation rhetoric, that there's also an assumption that it's about getting people together to build consensus. And I think quite the opposite. We're living in a world where what we need to be having is a series of very difficult conversations, right? And finding within those difficult conversations, small areas where people can come together and nudge change. And I think that you're quite right to say that this is not going to be a program where we should all sit together and sing Kumbaya. This is a program where we should be facilitating very difficult conversations. And I think you and Danny both made the point this morning about why that's urgent, and a race to the bottom is just untenable, right? But let's be frank, you represent some donors. Isn't part of the big problem on this mixed scorecard the way that donors fund? I mean, everybody talks the talk on, oh yes, problems are complex, so we need adaptive approaches. Oh yes, we should get flexible funding over long periods so that locally led change can happen. But hats off to the VHP Foundation, who actually seem to have managed this around this grant. But I really can't think of anybody else doing this at the moment. I mean, maybe you tell me. But why is everybody still talking this talk and so few donors walking the walk?
Yeah, it's a culture change and it's a systems change, and it takes time. And that's not to make excuses. I think that there are some areas of progress, is not enough. So, and some have gone different directions, right? So you've got a Samantha Power at USAID that set a 25% target. She must know they're not going to get there. You put the target and you try and incentivize the change and move the system that way. You've got a Hewlett approach. We're going to think and build around focus countries. So we're only going to work on programming that in this set of countries, that's an issue that's resonating local, and we're hearing from our partners on the ground that that's something they care about and want to work on. And you go that approach. So it's a different angle to localization. I think a lot of these funders that are figuring out, you know, their approach within these range of options. And it takes a while for the modalities to catch up. Like we are seeing more core funding and more longer term funding amongst our members. It's not as big a shift as I would like, but it is a shift. The numbers back it up. But you know, take an example of the Green Accountability Project that was being collaborating with the Global Partnership for Social Accountability on. It's all about funding local projects and trying to do it in a like genuine call for proposals type of way. But at the moment, the only way they can do that is through contracts, not even grants. And you have to be able to comply with World Bank procurement guidelines. So, you know, as you know, well, Kathy, that's not an easy process. So that's one extreme, but there are still degrees of that, even in philanthropy and in certainly in bilaterals that we've got to work our way through. But there are ways to do it. I think one is to think about a cohort approach. And I actually think BHP is good on this too. They invest a lot in learning between partners. MacArthur, I think, is really good in that way, like that it's a conscious effort of thinking about portfolio. How do they work together and what is their collective impact? And the responsibility is on the funder to measure and track that collective impact, not on the individual partners to do it. And there was a piece in the Stanford Social Innovation Review this summer that was from Roddenberry Foundation. It found the resource governance issues, but it struck home. They were talking about there's an inherent bias in the funding community that you have to go big or go home, like, and particularly at the moment, in face of so many pressures on our study, and that pushes you to funding big organizations running big ships. But they actually went in, and the portfolios they care about, they found ways of, if you fund local groups embedded in, they can still influence systems change. Just because you're local doesn't mean that you can't have a bigger ripple effect and impact. And so I think part of it is sharing those types of examples, building those examples within the natural resource governance space, and changing that mindset a little bit, because if the default assumption is, shoot, we're in a mess, the only way is we're going to throw quite a huge amount of money at this, and that means that only these types of organizations can receive money and comply. We're never actually going to get to that sort of level of change.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think it's, you know, you and I both worked at the World Bank. People might look at this program and say, $6 million, what can you do with $6 million in the bank, right? I actually think it's great that the BHP Foundation has put a good amount of money on the table. It's not huge by World Bank standards, but the solutions to these problems are not problems that need a ton of money either. It's about funding processes that are locally led with learning at the center to nudge systems change. This does not need billions of dollars. I'm sorry, I know it's the annual meetings of the World Bank, and I'm probably, if anybody's listening, AJ's chances of doing a capital increase. But, you know, it's not huge money that's needed. What's needed is a different way of nudging and supporting as external allies change. So if you are a funder out there and you want to mitigate some of your risk and come in with the BHP Foundation to try and do things differently, please do let us know. We would be very happy to work with you. Now, I've got more questions, but I just want to make sure from Mario, if there I want to make sure we have people online coming in if possible.
Yes, really quick. There are like 3 questions. At least 2, I would say that you already like touched base on it. So I just want to mention it regardless, right? One was from before, and it was about the importance, right, of political economic constraints and factors, and if really like international partners, donors, and so on are actually using political economy analysis to inform their strategies. That is the complete question. The second question is about how do we facilitate bridging the gap from research and advocacy to practical assistance? And there is a third one, but let me just go back to it in a moment. But those are the 2 questions that we have.
Okay, so a nice one about political economy at the moment. When I started my career, that was something we lobbied for, and then we all did a bunch of studies that stayed on shelves. Hopefully that's not the case anymore. I'm showing my age. But tell us a bit from Accountability Lab's perspective. How does one do meaningful political economy around your programs in a way that you understand the context that you're working in, not once, but the whole time, every day that you all come to work?
Ooh, good question. I think, look, I mean, we're not researchers, we're not economists, we're not historians, we're not necessarily political scientists or anthropologists. I think we're a little bit of all of them because we live in the places in which we survive, right? So, and which we work. So on a daily basis, we're sort of analyzing where we're at, what are we looking at, who are we talking to, why are we talking to them, what are they responding to us? And I think that what is always really helpful is, we have all these people that know that last year there was electricity on Tuesday, Thursdays, Fridays, and Saturdays, and now there's electricity on Wednesdays. Why is that? And so suddenly we start asking questions about what is happening there, and is this in the case of South Africa, our team faces it every day. I think as most people know, and I think the conversations then sort of lend themselves to, is this because we don't have enough coal to fire the stations? Is it because the coal is dirty and because it's not working? Is it because somebody stole it? Is it because what? And I think that once we start asking those questions, I think you sort of, and you bring the community with you, or at least our communities, which are interested in our issues, you suddenly then have a whole lot of, I mean, in South Africa, everyone is the world expert on state capture. We have lots of thoughts. We know things, we read the paper, you talk to the Uber guy will tell you all about how his wife can't get a job because of state capture. And I think, you know, that taking apart, you know, aside from the reports, and I know that I'm not quite answering your question, but I think aside from the reports, I think when you live the political economy, you respond to what you're living and what you're seeing. And I think with the right tools and resources and coalitions and partners and working together, elbows down, and just sort of focusing on what you're good at, I think you then create these bigger spaces where you can actually foster change and using what you've lived today.
Yeah.
That there was no electricity again.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Let's see if we can tackle the second one too, which, if I understand it, is about how these coalitions can move from an advocacy agenda, which, you know, I came from the civil society sector. I lobbied the World Bank on 50 years enough. We were very good at advocacy, but at some point, as the question suggests, people are wanting to see how you move from advocacy to actually instilling change in these very unequal global systems. Any thoughts from you, Michael, on how coalition type approaches, including powerful inside people in governments or global institutions, can make that shift from advocacy to practical systems change?
I mean, I think that is the whole point of the coalition approach and having an inside and outside game. I think the clarifier I would put on the question is, it's one thing to have, but the advocacy tends to lead to a policy ask, which might then lead to legislation or a regulatory change. I think particularly in our fields, and Danny talks to this far better than I do, what we've then realized is there's a huge gap on implementation. So the advocacy is only step one, and yes, you need a coalition that can mobilize and get that win, but the win only gets you so far, and then the forces kick in and undermine implementation. And so you need a coalition that actually then brings in, this is where I love the accountability of working with civil servants. Like, these are the people who end up with the day-to-day responsibility of making these things happen. How do you get their bosses to stay incentivized to keep pushing for those elements? So it really does require government, industry, civil society to play their part, and independent academia analysts to sort of keep feeding in that independent viewpoint. But,
and doing it over and over again, as you, I mean, I love the Asia Foundation work on coalitions for change, and they've done some very powerful stuff on changing policy, funding from government around health, with a tax on cigarettes, for example. But the policy quickly becomes a policy on paper that might not be implemented. So then you have to bring the coalition back to the table and look at the implementation gap, right? So as you say, over and over again, it's not a one-off coalition approach. Yeah, very, very interesting. Let me open it up to this room too. Is there some questions inside, and how long do we have, Mario?
I mean, yeah, we're basically out of time. We know we have invited everybody here in the room, like, to stay around for some networking conversation for a little bit. Those online that can stay with us a few extra minutes for additional comments, please, are more than welcome. But please, yes, if anybody has any reaction on what has been said here in the room or also online, let us know, please.
Yes, please. Would you mind introducing yourself? And yes,
yes, my name is Alejandro Lara, and it's very nice to be here today. I learned a lot how to move on with our lives and, you know, your projects and things like that. And also acknowledge Daniel Kaufman, which is sitting on my left. I happened to, we met during my time at the World Bank many years ago, and he's been one of my admirers, always follow him all the time. I want to start just very briefly with a topic that is a result of my dissertation research. It's called At the Intersection of Lifelong Learning, Aging, Technology, and Brain Sciences, and why those four domains interact. Because lifelong learning, you mentioned several times, it's about learning, it's about educating ourselves throughout our lives. So it's not just investing or spending. Most people use the word spending, and I don't like that. It's about investing in early education. It's investing about, I divide it up in 3 phases. 1, early, 2, mid-level, and 3, aging population. Because most times, especially multilaterals and some nonprofits, tend to forget about investing in aging population.
Alejandro, can I urge you to ask a question?
So the question is how to better invest in that aging population, in the adult population, because it's about not forgetting about that segment, which is very important. We're missing the institutional knowledge on how to apply these concepts. So yes, investing rather than spending.
Okay, thank you. Let me invite you to give any reactions to that. Let me also try and reframe that, because you've spurred a very interesting thought, and I'd love to see your thesis, Alejandro, in about adaptive mindsets. Because these people who do this work well, and I mean playing a supportive role in supporting local actors to solve complex problems, we know have adaptive mindsets, which means they have a lifelong love of learning, right? And they are willing to take risks and try things that fail. And Danny said this morning, we should be prepared to fail and learn from it, right? Any thoughts on Alejandro's questions, or any thoughts more broadly on adaptive mindsets and how we might do this in this project, how we might do that more broadly with donors, examples of how you've done this in Accountability Lab, Jean, and maybe Amanda and Miguel, if either of you have any thoughts on this learning and adaptive mindsets question that Alejandro's thesis has brought up, please let us know. It looks like Amanda might have something to say. Very hard to tell from here, Amanda, but do you have something to say?
Thank you. It's a very interesting question. And, I think we do so much work in adult learning, but I think interesting to reflect on different stages in adulthood too, and how adults learn differently. So I think that's a really interesting reflection. And more generally, I think that the learning communities and I think the potential for the Governance Action Hub is really to foster dialogue and exchange of ideas as an entry point for more radical collaboration and collective action. But that is done through looking at issues from different angles, and it will require, I think, a very carefully and systematically facilitated process that includes guiding the group through analysis of political economy and diagnosing root causes of some of the challenges, and supporting the group to really reflect on power dynamics and incentives at play that may impede progress, and helping them to move toward action plans or co-creating something together that they can adapt and use in their contexts. So I think it really will require difficult conversations, as has been highlighted, and really real reflection on challenges and failures as much as successes. It's not just about trading best practices, but I think some of the most rich and valuable learning is really on reflecting from failures and challenges. And that can be a really important starting point too.
Yeah. Danny, you have something to add on both?
Yeah, a frank question to, this is a very relevant, interesting panel, Kathy and group, congratulations. What increasingly I'm concerned that we don't hear enough, and I wonder whether it's being underplayed or there is, and if there is a reason for that, is the role of empirical, of data, the power of data for all of these type of incredibly important initiatives. Because I'm concerned otherwise we run the perennial risk of very long prose and lots of statements, but where is the evidence? And particularly as I'm concerned in the so-called post-fact world, where again, the evil opposition is very good at providing fake data, but it's data. They provided that. And I wonder whether we counteract that with real data as opposed to lots of words. How many reports, how many conferences we have where the ratio between words and data point is infinite?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I wonder if anybody can speak to this question of how feedback loops and how research and how surveys, for example, and evaluations have evolved over the last 2 or 3 years to precisely make sure that we're working in these complex areas, but with evaluation or learning processes that are fit for context, right? That are not necessarily, not everything needs an RCT, some things do, but not everything. And so I wonder if you can, either of you speak to the, I wish Tom Aston was here because he's a member of our team and he's thinking very hard about this, Danny. But how do we use data and how do we use evidence still to make sure that this isn't just a talk shop, or a few people in a room that's got some ideas that we'll try out, and then maybe we'll see if there's any success, but we won't really have any good data to look at. Michael.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one area where actually funded practice is evolving. So there's much more flexibility about thinking about how you conceive of and measure success and impact. And case in point would be Luminate, who when I started with TI, they required quarterly reporting. They set like conditional indicators where if you didn't meet that, your funding was at risk. And they're now on a completely different track. It's built around hypotheses and testing hypotheses.
With data.
With data.
Yes.
And they take what they can from the partners' work, and it's to inform their understanding of how they're meeting them. That's just one demonstration. So I think there has been a significant evolution. I think my little pushback to Danny is that I think you said it yourself, like the data is so contested, you can put a lot of effort into putting together accurate, true evidence. But if you can't get people to take that on board and not dismiss it out of hand, it's difficult. And we are seeing disinformation impact this sector. It's not just in the health sector. It's like there was a rare earths mine that was going to be built in Malaysia, and a Chinese disinformation camp pretty much scuppered that thing. And you can influence public opinion. You can use different competing data sources. So, yes, we need the hard data. We need to build our cases, particularly where you make investments around that. But we need to be sensitive to it's a rough game out there.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think with our civic action teams, we do a lot of data collection that's based on data collection. I think the big question around data is, how do you share it? In which ways? How do you slice and dice? How do you, create spaces that data doesn't suddenly become something that is exclusive, that again gets printed in some form or some book and then disappears. And so, data forms the foundation of data, my word. I'm like, why am I speaking? No, I mean, data forms the foundation of everything that we do within the civic action teams, because you can't say, hey, 67% of the community gets the same issues if you don't know. You can't, until you actually have that information or you've asked the question. The problem that we often face is, great, so now you're going to share this with people and they're going to do what with it? Or can you share it in a way, what happens if people can't read? Or what happens if somebody is very young and doesn't know necessarily what to do with it, or if they're older? And I think and the challenge with development practitioners, professionals, or even donors is that they collect all this stuff and don't actually use their expertise to slice and dice it in a way that makes it useful for other people to use. And so I believe that it's our job to say, great, we have now collected all of this information. That's the easy part. The hard part now is to take that information and say, okay, so here is some stuff that may be really useful to young people between the ages of 16 and 25. How are we going to meet them where they're at? Where is this information going to be useful? How are we going to share it? Is it going to be through social media? Is it going to be through a music campaign? Is it going to be through digital art campaign that we're going to beam onto doors and windows? Maybe that's what we're going to do. Okay, here is a different part of that information that is not, we're not picking and choosing information, I think we all did political science where you're like, oh, but are you messing with the source? You're not. You're literally taking it and saying what is useful for whom and how are we sharing it so that data becomes something that everyone can be empowered to use in a way that is useful to them in the grocery store. When they're having a fight with whoever is asking them for a lot of money to pay taxes and they're like, well, I have not had electricity in 6 weeks, you know, and that's how communities, particularly in places even like South Africa, where they're saying, we now know it's going to cost this much money for us to hire a private company to build solar farms outside of our community, and we're going to redirect X percentage of our taxes, and I'm not advocating for people not to pay their taxes, but you know, but we're going to, quick PSA, but you know, I think we're going to redirect a bunch of this money and we're going to say, hey, this company through these solar farms can actually feed us electricity that we haven't had in months, or water, or whatever that is. And that all came from data, and that was all community members who were empowered with information that was relevant to them.
Right. So it's not just data for evidence, it's data for evidence, for advocacy, for change.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, very interesting.
And
Thank you.
meeting
I hope
people where
that's
they're
an
at.
answer. Yeah, I'm meeting people where they're at. Great. I think I'm being told I need to wrap everything up. I want to thank everybody, Amanda, Miguel on the screen. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you, Miguel, for sharing your wonderful experience in Peru. We wish you well, and I hope you get over your flu. Michael, thank you for coming back and sharing a panel with me. Jean, lovely to meet you, and thank you so much for all the wonderful work that Accountability Lab is leading. As I said at the beginning, we have a lot to learn from everybody on this panel, and we have actually, we did a listening tour in the design of the Governance Action Hub where we spoke, I know we spoke to you, and I know Mario spoke to you guys too, but I think we spoke to over 30 organizations, and we completely shifted our thinking on a lot of stuff, and we will continue to shift our thinking until we get this right. So thank you everybody for being so candid and open with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Miguel and Amanda. Thank you to our panelists. Much appreciated, guys. Thank you for joining us for all this time. I know that it's a lot that we have demanded from you. We will have like a little bit of time outside. Please join us for refreshments, the rest of the food that we have, and for some networking, and hopefully we can be in touch. We hope to be able to collaborate, to work together with you and others in particular geographies or in this global work in which we may be able to do some partnership, explore some issues like the issue of data that everybody that people have been bringing up, how that also translates to dynamics, for example, at the local level, right? Like Miguel, for example, I know that we ran out of time, but it's like we are actually experiencing one particular line of work in Moquegua precisely that come out around data that actually came from the community, right? Like, and now it's on, and now it's supported by an external donor, right? That in the beginning we were not engaging with. So these kind of dynamics that have grown organically, but that were only possible because we had people in the room regularly in a non-threatening environment, in a non-negotiation environment, right? That actually had very different perspectives about things, including like some people that were anti-mining, right? Like in a mining, in a heavy mining area, for example, in Peru. Are these kind of things, this kind of experience doesn't have the same, something that we can explore in other places? Like, how is it that we can work together better, like in this space? We hope to be able to answer some of these questions over the next few years. Thank you for your support, for your friendship, and we're just gonna invite you to go outside and actually enjoy for a few refreshments before we leave. Thank you. Thank you, guys. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.